Kamen Rider Saber will probably go down in the history books for being one of the craziest seasons of the franchise, and it's a trait that has stuck with the show since day zero. It began with a pretty by-the-book trademark name reveal, but soon after it changed its story with a second trademark reveal, marking the earliest time the title image for a season had been revealed. There were a lot of rumors speculating that the next season would have a brother and sister duo as the primary characters, but this was debunked with the new title. Due to the design with some extra characters saying Holy Sword and some new runes in a book design, it appeared that Saber would revolve around swords and books. Suit design rumors built on this idea by introducing knights, with one describing the suit's armor taking the appearance of open books, including the visor. Another rumor described Saber taking the appearance of Cyclone Joker Extreme, with 3 different colors, a dragon shoulder, and a flame visor. Both rumors involved swords going down the body, paired with the belt rumored to be a big sword sheath with a handle sticking out and an open book attached to the top. This spawned a bit of speculation art, some of which would actually get briefly mistaken to be the real design. Due to Toei and Bandai cracking down on leaks after 01, Saber would be the first Rider season in a long time to not have a Q1 catalog scan leak. Let's please take a moment of silence for those catalog scans, since we got listings instead. They revealed that this show would start off with 7 riders, 3 of them using the Seiken sword driver, another 3 utilizing different swords, and the last one using a new belt. The gimmicks were all books and varied from dragons to lions to Aladdin to the 3 little pigs, in addition to elemental crests that had an unknown purpose at the time. Our first look at Kamen Rider Saber came later in the month with the cover of a magazine showing us his helmet and his belt. And the whole thing would later reveal Kamen Rider Blaze and the Peter Pan and Jack in the Beanstalk forms, demonstrating the Wonder Ride book's unique mix and match gimmick that didn't require completely covering the belt. Just a few days after this, we got the official press conference, and it gave us a trailer and officially announced the show, revealing the actors for Saber and Blades, while also providing the first looks at Kamen Rider Espada, Kamen Rider Kenzan, and the suits for Kamen Rider Buster and Caliber. The writing would take a familiar turn by bringing back the mind behind the very successful Kamen Rider Ghost, while also taking a new path and introducing an ending dance to the Kamen Rider franchise. Our first look at the season of Saber came in the form of an episode 0, but it just featured Mei and Toma commenting on the currently airing Kamen Rider 01 in a set that would not be used in the actual show, and this is basically considered non-canon. Due to the circumstances of the world at the time, there was no summer movie or space in 01 for Saber to cameo in, and toy reviews, previews, and new magazines had to suffice until the newest chapter of Kamen Rider opened its pages on September 6. In my experience, Saber's first arc was not received very well for the big reason that its pacing is too fast. And, well, I disagree with the pacing part. It's definitely the worst arc of Saber, but to me the main problem comes from this lack of impact. Yes, we do get introduced to a lot of ideas in a short amount of time. That's not really the problem. The problem is these ideas aren't paired with a powerful storyline to make them feel like they matter, to make them stick with the audience, and more often than not, they just feel hollow. Toma's sword gets sealed, but it's like a minor inconvenience. His missing memories are like a background plot. They're gone with no explanation. They come back with no explanation. It doesn't do anything. Rintaro gets so disrespected because there is a powerful storyline with him. His rivalry with Zeus is built up over a couple of episodes, but this doesn't stick the landing because there's like no conclusion to it. He defeats a normal monster and then he forgets the rivalry for the rest of the arc, and his power-up has no tie-in. These aren't really problems with the pacing. The Wonder combos debuting 3 episodes in a row isn't inherently the problem. It's the fact that the show doesn't really make their individual debuts stand out with a big story and conclusion. Rintaro trains for his combo but lacks a confrontation with Zeus. Toma just sorta happens upon his books, and Kento is literally handed his remaining book by Miss Girlboss. This sort of applies to the characters as well, who also suffer from a lack of impact, but I see a bit of a twist with this. We don't really learn anything about Rintaro in his debut other than a few basic character traits. Ren is sort of a background character in his first appearance. No one addresses Kento debuting as Espada, and then there's a build up to Slash, but then there's nothing really done with the story behind his Seiken. Even most of the forms are nothing more than cameos Toma randomly acquires, but I saw this as an interesting take on world building. The Wonder Ride books are meant to be these elemental power sources that any of the riders can use, and by having Saber mix them up, the idea of this is always at the forefront. These are meant to be just quick, one-off boosts of power, not an upgrade to his power set. I cannot stress how cool it is to me that the first marketed forms for Saber are just random combos. In regards to the characters, I thought not learning much about them off the bat added to this universe. Kenzan is just another rider. There's nothing special about him, so why focus on him? Slash's missing history and Kento's pre-established nature just adds to the idea of how in over his head Toma is by joining this fight. And with how amazing Saber's aesthetics are, I was actually already having a lot of fun with this show this early on, but I do agree it could have been better. A lot of people, including myself, joke about Saber being a Sentai. If you unironically think Saber is a Sentai show, you need to uncross your wires. But honestly, I think it should have taken a page out of Sentai's playbook. I think these first few episodes should have just been character focused, just about Toma interacting with and learning about one of the members of this team he's just joined. We can learn about Rintaro's backstory with the organization before his rivalry with Zeus. When we learn about Ren, we can learn about his relationship with Kento initially before it's just randomly introduced. And then you ramp up the plot towards the end of the arc, because right now it kind of feels like Toma barely knows these people. That's why Buster was my favorite character in the beginning. There was this impact of learning about him and his child, and the literal impact of his sword. And the twist of Toma's first form change really being his power set was really awesome. Kento's story was actually the most interesting to me since he had this personal vendetta against Calibur's really hot vocalizer.
失われた炎の剣が現れたか。火炎剣劣化とブレイブドラゴンを渡してもらおうか。お前が見ているものが真実とは限らない。
Then they ended up mirroring each other by both falling prey to their ambitions, blocking out their friends for help, and dying. Or Kento like passed out or something and then died. It was kind of dumb, to be honest. That's kind of what I mean with this lack of impact. We make this big deal about Kento dying at the hands of Calibur, but then the next episode he's just passed out, but then he really does die. The other characters are fine. I really liked Dai Shinji's blacksmith background, and Mei is really overhated in my opinion. I particularly related to her getting super excited about Rintaro's power-ups. I can relate to getting that excited over one tokusatsu character getting more powerful. So overall, I won't deny that this first arc was pretty messy and had a lot of room for improvement, but I enjoyed it, and one of the best parts was how the show kind of improved this arc as it went on. The second arc of Saber is my favorite arc of the season for a lot of reasons. I love the twist with the Sword of Logos turning against Toma and branding him as a traitor. It's such an insane development for our hero organization to be the real villains of the show. I love that the characters aren't brainwashed, and instead, in a weird way, it kind of takes advantage of the flimsy writing in the prior arc. I mentioned the fast pacing and how it felt like Toma barely knew the members of his team, and the result is that they barely know him and they don't really trust him and are able to turn on him very easily. The core attributes that were pretty much their entire personalities gets brought to the forefront, so it gives each of them a unique motivation. Rintaro is loyal to the Logos, and missing Sophia means he has to follow Rekka now. Ren is loyal to Kento, and Toma is following the words of his killer, and the other two have already had a Saber betray them after dueling a Calibur. I thought it was a really impactful story idea, and the trajectory of it over the course of not just this arc, but the rest of the season is also amazing. Because each of the characters got a different motivation for fighting Toma, they defect from the Sword of Logos at different times. The result is that when Toma tries to get them to join his side again, we actually get to learn learn about these people as characters. We learn more about the history of the Seikens from Daishinji in his swordsmith lineage, so he defects to fulfill his destiny of witnessing Toma fulfill his destiny. He also introduces us to Master Logos, and he foreshadows the final form before we even get the super forms. Ogami's relationships get more fleshed out because he defects by listening to his old friend and his son, but he also helps demonstrate how much more powerful of a swordsman Toma has become, no longer relying on his crutch of the Wonder Ride books, but as a hero starting to grow into a true swordsman. This arc also does a really good job at improving Toma. Obviously, with all these interactions to win back the team, we get to see how skillful he can be with other people, but it also gives him this more personal story with Elemental Primitive Dragon. I liked that it connected back to the beginning of the show when Toma used his storytelling abilities to make friends with kids, and here he conquers a thirst for power by making friends with a kid, which in a way connected to this larger story where he needed to make friends with the Sword of Logos. It would have been so easy to replicate this pattern with Rintaro and Ren, but instead the show gives them a unique path. Ren's motivation has always been about Kento, so when he returns and is branded as a traitor, it's only natural that Ren defects to his side. But when Kento betrays him as well, we see his development really shine. In search of strength, he finds an unlikely alliance with the free spirit of Disaster, creating a fun pairing with the serious swordsman of Wind. I love how this relationship comes to a close with Disaster finally finding meaning in life by helping Ren finally find his inner strength, and they close out this friendship the same way it ended. And then we get this amazing fight scene as an epilogue to that moment. Like, it's from the third arc. I know we're skipping ahead, but like, just look at it. It's so cool. So Ren definitely became a great character starting in this arc, but finished out in the third arc, and he's really awesome. For Rintaro, since we know he was raised by the organization, of course he'd feel much more conflicted about defecting, not to mention he was being gaslighted by Rekka the entire time. But when he's completely isolated from his teammates because of his organization's loyalty, he's able to realize what's really important to him, specifically his promise to stay loyal to Toma. So instead of defecting because Toma duels and convinces him, Toma's indirect influence breaks Rintaro out of his confining loyalties. From there, the two of them finally get to work together again to save Mei, solidifying her importance as a supporting character and this whole friendship with the three of them. There's something so beautiful about how Toma beats the veterans in duels with the growing power of Rekka, and instead of the finale to this being a duel to bring Rintaro back to his side, it's a simple training session to teach his friend the technique so that they can work together again at long last. This arc did an amazing job at taking the flimsy core ideals of the characters in the beginning and then using that to provide the necessary impact to turn them into, in my opinion, an amazing rider cast. But it doesn't stop there, because for the most part, I thought the new characters were just as cool. Rekka transforming into a rider was such a satisfying moment after she's been in the show for quite a while. I enjoyed that this happened as a retaliation after the two veterans defected, but it was hinted at since the first arc, and she's just pretty badass as Sabala. And then I think it's awesome that the show didn't ruin this part of her at all. Shindai? So Durandal is the worst character in this show to me because he's just... Sorry, who was I talking about again? Oh, yeah, Durandal. He's really just Reika's brother. Like, his entire personality is Reika's brother. He's really forgettable, and if that wasn't bad enough, he actually ruins Reika as a character because she goes from the calm, collected girl boss to, Can you just be quiet? To be honest, I don't really mind happy Rekka, since in fights she stays serious, but I really don't like happy Rekka when it has to do with her brother, because the show gets really uncomfortably weird with it. Literally, all you had to do to fix this was get rid of those weird interactions or just make them not related to each other, and then Rekka stays awesome. It doesn't really fix Durandal, but at least he doesn't ruin another character. To fix Durandal, I don't know, just give him any sort of real personality. Maybe you could switch him to be Rekka's prodigy younger brother, and he's been training for most of the show, and that's why he's initially powerful, but then he falls off really quickly because he has no real world experience, and then Rekka's just overprotective of him, and that's like why she's a little more happier, but please none of the weird stuff. Or you could just remove him entirely and then just have Rekka hold 2 Seikens, and then they just have to convince Rekka to join the team because she's like really mean to people.
元気ですか?
Honestly though, I still do like Rekka. There's just maybe a bit of bias there because she's my favorite actor in Kamen Rider. I really relate to her. She seems like a really cool person in real life. Hi Majin. Anyways, this arc most importantly introduces Yuri, who is my favorite character in the show. Yuri is just such a fun dude. He starts off by creating some great comedic scenes when learning about the modern world after living in a white room for so long, but he still manages to be really epic as it's part of this journey for rediscovering what it means to be a hero. He goes from being comic relief to being a comic book hero in a really satisfying way. Then the lore he adds to the show. Ooh boy, the lore. Yuri retroactively improves the somewhat sloppy King of Arthur and Dragonic Knight storylines because those are linked to Avalon, and Yuri was the guardian that Toma released from Avalon. There's a great Avalon aesthetic throughline with King Excalibur having the ability to wield Toma as a sword, and then there's the Shadow that wields Yuri as a sword on a smaller scale. Also, the fact that he's a sword, like his base form's a sword in the show about swords, is just awesome. Then there's his relationship to Tassel. Tassel started off as a fun narrator, but thanks to Yuri, Tassel becomes a character in the show. Never have I seen a show where like the narrator starts the episode on the phone with the character before remembering he has to do some recap for the show, or his narration gets interrupted by a character leaving to go into the actual show itself, or for a show to lose its narration for several episodes because the narrator is killed on screen twice. Yuri is that character. I really like this element of breaking the fourth wall shared by Yuri and Tassel. It's super cool for a show that revolves around literal storytelling, and I really got a kick out of it every time. But Yuri on his own is also just a great deal of fun, just like this whole arc. I think Saber really stepped up as a season, taking an opportunity with the messy parts of the beginning and crafting a really great continuation with so many awesome moments. There's so much packed into this, but it still all had the necessary impact and managed to really win me over. Saber's last stretch of episodes aren't as great as the middle section in my opinion, but instead I think it was a pretty solid build up to the finale and kept this momentum going. A big positive is that the villains finally got some time to shine, so let's talk about the villains overall. I never really had a problem with the Mega Trio. They were always unintentionally hilarious to me because at some point their base went from a real location to a green screen room, and I don't know, that was just funny. A lot of people complain they don't really have a personality, or alternatively they just all have the same personality, and I mean that's true, but I didn't really have a problem with it because they were more of like a backdrop, this constant pressure on the heroes so that they didn't take focus away from the larger threats like Caliber and the Sword of Logos. The worst one is definitely Legil because he like got angry at Toma and then he died. That was his whole character. And then I already talked about Zeus with his whole Rintaro rivalry that did have a pretty nice conclusion, even if the beginning was rough. Storius is the only one that really gets to do anything because he's literally the final boss, and as the final boss, I thought he served a good job at being the final boss. Right from the beginning, you could tell he had some bigger plans, whether it was conspiring with Caliber, or trespassing by using the other genres, or leaving his friends to die while he goes and creates himself a girlfriend that he has get eaten. I like that he's basically this evil mirror of Toma. Instead of being a writer who happens to be destined for great power and wants to use it to create a story that helps everyone, Storius is a poet who seeks great power in order to create a story where he destroys the world. Storius actually cares about what's in the Book of Omnipotence. Toma does not care what's in there. Also, he really needs to take some cough drops. Like, it probably hurt the actor. As for the other villains, Bahato has a very brief appearance in the season, but I actually really loved him. There was this sort of meta take on him to me because he at first appears as the final movie villain in the beginning, and then when he returns with literally no effort required, he's essentially on the level of a final boss in the audience's mind. So he's already like pretty powerful, and it made the debut of Cross Saber that much more exciting because we're basically defeating this big boss. For the villain calibers, I thought the original was meh. It was pretty obvious it wasn't Kento's dad, so the Kamijo reveal felt lackluster. On paper, I think Kento was a much more interesting caliber because of the whole future sight power of Kuriyami that he introduced, but it also retroactively improved Kamijo. Now we know that even if some of the stuff he was doing could be a bit strange, he knew the future to an extent, and there's that also neat touch with the one glove he wears, so he's not physically interacting with Kuriyami and activating its foresight. In execution though, Kento falls apart, and it's just because of a few dumb lines. He says nothing can change the future, and he has to do this all on his own, but then every other episode something happens, and he goes on about how the future is changing, but it isn't changing enough. It made his whole arc feel really dragged out, like he was being an edgy teen, trying to do everything on his own instead of going back to his friends for help, which got him killed the first time. I think he should have known everything about the future up until Solomon debuted, and then before that, maybe you could have him replace Tassel as the narrator because he died when Kento came back, because he's like a narrator, he knows about it all already, and then when the future becomes unknown, he realizes he has to stand by his friends once more, which is a key theme of the show. And that's also present with the standout villain of the show, Master Logos. Maybe not the final boss, but he's definitely, in my opinion, like the main big boss for the whole thing. My favorite part of him is just his like motivation. When Toma asks him why he's trying to destroy the world and stuff, he pretends like he's gonna give this big generic speech about a lost loved one before he straight up says, "That's what you want to hear, right?" Nah, I was just bored. It's almost like he was talking to Rider fans that are so used to having these tragic backstories, and then he's just letting everyone know that he's built different. That specific fourth wall break aspect of him is why he's my favorite villain here. Yeah, the simplicity of him is really cool, but there's something so exciting about how within the show he's almost aware he has subverted a trope. His defeat at the hands of Cross Saber represents the core of Kamen Rider Saber to me. I absolutely love Cross Saber, from its creation via union of the Seikens in space, to the sword itself harnessing new Wonder Ride book powers, to it using my favorite insert theme in Rider, to its power set solidifying these suits as my favorite in Kamen Rider. The debut is going to be my favorite form debut of the franchise for a very long time. It's always spectacular to see Cross harness all 10 elements and 10 Seikens that we've come to know and love throughout the season, especially knowing that it's also powered by 10 Kamen Riders and Mei learning to trust each other. This show may be jam-packed with all of these different stories and characters, but to me, it all served a grander purpose. Kamen Rider Saber isn't really a story about Kamen Rider Saber, even if he's the main character. The show isn't really about how Toma comes to become a rider and save the day because he's a novelist, not a hero. You really shouldn't look at this show for the individual chapters, but more of how it all comes together as one book. This is a story about how these individuals use training, trials, and storytelling in order to strengthen each other and rewrite each of their individual stories, overcoming a predetermined fate, and it all just so happens to funnel into Toma as the protagonist. Despite its flaws, all of the moving parts, over-the-top ideas, and crazy stories, I really fell in love with Kamen Rider Saber. This is the greatest experience I've ever had with a Rider season, whether it be discussing leaks, keeping up with rumors, anticipating the crossover, going broke, or just watching the show with my brother, and it'll definitely go down as a volume of the Kamen Rider franchise I will never forget. The only reason it doesn't crack my top 5 is just because those shows are really good while Saber is good. Be sure to let me know politely what you thought of this season down in the comment section. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. I'd also like to give a big shout out to my patrons for supporting me throughout most of Saber this past year. It really means a lot. It's like our own sort of logos or something. Bone lecture, everyone.